Hello and welcome to Philosophy 13, Introduction to Ethics. I'm Nate Greeley. We met earlier on our live Zoom session, so this is the first of the recorded lectures. Um, and the vast majority of all the lectures will be this format, right? So you can watch them at your leisure, whenever you like. If we have any future need for live sessions, we'll let you know at that time. So we could start with answering the question, what is ethics? Now answering that in any sort of super rigorous way, uh, being that this is philosophy, right? You could write a whole book, you could teach a whole course just trying to define what ethics is, right, before you even get started studying it. We're not going to do that. So just broadly, roughly, um, ethics is the study of how we should live our lives, right? It answers the question, what should I do? In other courses, you probably answer the questions about how the world is, right? What is the case? In ethics, we study what ought to be the case, right? How should we govern our lives? What goals should we pursue in the most general sense, right? Um, it's relatively easy to answer questions in a more specific sense, right? Um, Something like, what should I do if I want to do well in this course? Well, that's easy to answer. I do the readings, attend the lectures, um, time to write a good paper, and so on. But if you keep asking those questions, well, why should I do well in this course, right? And so on, you'll find that in the most general sense, we're asking, what is the big picture goal that everyone ought to be striving for? And those are the sorts of questions we're going to be answering here. Um, so if you ask anyone, what should I do? People are typically more than happy to give you an answer, right? Ask a politician what you should do, and they'll probably will involve giving them some money, right, or voting for them. If you ask your pastor what you should do, they can give you some answers, right? Your parents and so on. So ethics, right, an ethics course in a philosophy department at a university, we don't have a monopoly on telling you what you should do, but we do have a very specific approach, right? Which is that we prioritize reasoning. So the answers that we're going to explore in this course about what you should do, um, we're going to strive to answer that question in a sort of transparent, non-biased way that gives reasons, right, that you can either agree with or not, right? But it's never going to be sort of like just dictating to you. So you're not required to agree with any of the theories, right, or ethical claims in this course. Um, but if you want to disagree with something that's in the text or something I say or something another student says, we just ask that you provide some reasons, right, for your conclusions. Um, we are all held to the same standard here, which is if you draw a conclusion, right, give us a reason to believe it. So that's going to be part of my job is to help you practice that, right? Learn what it means to give reasons for a conclusion, how to find a good reason, what counts as a good reason and what doesn't. And that's going to come in handy in the rest of your life, right? So we're doing it in the context of ethics, but obviously this process of constructing arguments, convincing other people to draw conclusions will also serve you outside of ethics. The world is full of arguments once you start to recognize them, right? A job interview is in a sense an argument, right? The conclusion of which is you should hire me, right? Anytime you want to convince your friend about which restaurant you want to go to, that's an argument, right? And so on. Many of you will probably at some point in this course be trying to provide me with an argument that I should, whatever, extend the deadline for a certain time or something like that. So it's a general skill. We'll help you start to get better at it here in the domain of ethics. So this course, I think it's helpful for you if um, there's a text that's fairly straightforward, and I think the Rachel's text is it's a pretty standard one in introductory ethics because it's very clearly written that it covers all the main ethical theories. And so I want the lectures to reinforce the reading as well as the assignments, right? So I'm not telling you all kinds of random stuff that's disconnected from the readings and so on. So these lectures will largely track what the book says, right? If there are points where I sort of disagree with the book or have more to add, I'll do that. But it's not going to be, they're all going to reinforce each other. So Rachel's begins with a little anecdote, right, to sort of get the feel for what ethical problems look like, right? What does ethical reasoning look like? He begins with baby Theresa. So Theresa Oncampo Pearson, uh, a newborn born with a condition called anencephaly, right, which basically means you can see roughly from this drawing, um, significant parts of the brain are missing, right? Um, there is some left. The brain stem is left intact, so uh, the child is able to breathe, right? The heart beats, um, but we can pretty safely assume that this child has no conscious experience, right? No feelings, no beliefs, no desires, nothing that you would normally attribute to, right, the experience of being a self, right, or a conscious being in the world. They just don't have the parts of the brain that we believe are connected with those types of experiences, right? So typically, when a baby's born with this condition, they die fairly soon. You can't not live very long in that condition. So her parents thought they could make the best of a bad situation by donating, right, the child's perfectly healthy organs, right, nothing wrong with the heart, the lungs, the liver, and so on. Um, they thought perhaps we could transplant those organs into a child who needed them. Um, Now this had to be done right while in the first few days while the child was still breathing, heart beating, and so on. If they waited until she died, the organs would be unusable. Um, Unfortunately for them, Florida state law forbids this, right? You cannot take organs out of a child while they are technically still alive, right? That would be killing them, right? So the question is, who's right? So this is a sort of a good example of an ethical question, right? Is it right or wrong to transplant, right, Teresa's organs? And we have the parents who thought it would be a good thing, right? It would be the right thing to do. You have the state of Florida saying, no, this is wrong and it's forbidden by law. Um, Now, the sort of reasoning on the side of the state of Florida is maybe fairly obvious, right? Technically, removing Teresa's organs would kill her. But then the question is, uh, she's alive, but in not a particularly robust sense, right? We already said she has no conscious experience at all. So it's not the sort of life that any of us uh, would probably call a normal human life, right? Or even potentially a life even worth living, right? Um, so some ethicists actually sided with the state, right? Um, Calling the plan to transplant these organs, quote, horrendous, right? And at least one of the principles quoted is it is unethical to kill person A, save person B. So here we have a reason for a conclusion, right? The conclusion was um, we should not, what should we do? We should not transplant Teresa's organs. Why? What reason can you give? It is unethical to kill one person to save another. Now, as it stands, I can see some big holes, right, in that moral principle. Perhaps you can think of some situations where it is ethical to kill one person to save another, right? I could imagine, right, an axe murderer running towards you or your loved one or your child or something, and yeah, if the police sort of shoot the axe murderer before they can kill another person, that's technically killing person A to save person B, right? That's probably moral. So we need to flesh that reason out, right? But we will. And you should, in general, practice uh, reading charitably, right? So even if you see a reason stated that on the face of it seems false, because you can think of counterexamples, take some time and try to sort of interpret it in the most charitable light. That will make for more interesting argumentation and ultimately for better papers when it comes time to write your essay. Um, so obviously the parents and the doctors that were planning to do this operation, this transplant, didn't think the plan was horrendous. In fact, they thought it was the right thing to do, right? Um, they could benefit another child, right? Um, and baby Teresa's life, such as it was, it didn't seem like she was losing that much, right? She would die soon anyways, and her life as it um, was nothing near what we would consider a sort of fulfilling human life, right? But let's get into the arguments on either side and be a little more explicit about the reasons. So here's one way we might reconstruct the parents' argument that we should do this transplant. So here's sort of how in philosophy frequently arguments will be in 1, 2, 3, right? And the last number is typically the conclusion, and the previous numbers are reasons to believe the conclusion. And sometimes later numbers will depend on earlier numbers. So sometimes, like, the reason you should believe number 2 will be number 1, right? And so on. So here is how this argument goes. Premise 1 or reason 1: if we can benefit someone without harming someone else, we should. Sounds plausible enough, right? We'll get into each premise on its own, right? What we'll be doing is, in this class a lot, is taking premises one by one and doing a lot of scrutiny, right, to what often seem like plausible premises, and sometimes will turn out that they're maybe actually false, even though they initially seem plausible, sometimes not, right? Premise 2: transplanting the organs would help other children without harming baby Teresa, right? So 1 is a general principle about when it's okay when we should benefit someone, right? And 2 is sort of a concrete um, instantiation of that more general principle. They're saying this situation with baby Teresa is a case of benefiting someone, the children that receives a transplanted organ, without harming someone else. So implicitly here, they're saying they're not harming baby Teresa, right? Well, not implicitly, they explicitly say it, sorry. Therefore, conclusion, we should transplant the organs. So that's the argument. Is it a good one? Well, what it means to say an argument is a good one means that A, the premises are true, right? You can't have a good argument with a false premise. Right? If one of the reasons is just not true, then it can't lend support to the conclusion. But the other thing you need is there a connection between the premises and the conclusion, right? If the premises are true, does that sort of force you to believe the conclusion? Um, Now, if the premises are true, and they entail the conclusion. Again, the word entail just means, right, they sort of force you, the conclusion follows from them or forces you to believe the conclusion. Um, then we say the argument is sound, right? If an argument is sound, we mean that means the conclusion is true and we can believe it. So is this argument sound, right? Are the premises true and do the premises lead to the conclusion? Let's focus on what's probably the most controversial claim, right? The first claim, the general premise, which says, yeah, if we can benefit someone without harming someone else, we should do it. That seems plausible enough. You can investigate it further if you like, but for now, the second premise seems the one that's the most obviously controversial, right? The controversial part of it is that they claim they're not harming baby Teresa, right, by taking out her organs. I imagine you can think of one obvious way in which it could be said to harm baby Teresa. It would kill her, right? Killing is a kind of harm, is it not, right? So is premise 2 false, right? If it's false, then it's not a good argument. So that's the question, right? Is killing someone harming them? Typically, yes, right? Most of us would say, yes, please don't kill me. It is harmful to me. But Teresa is a very particular case, right? Why do we usually say that to kill someone is to harm them? Well, because usually we have some sort of interest in staying alive. Why do we have an interest in staying alive? Because some good will come out of it for us. We will have pleasurable experiences, right? We will eat good food, drink good wine, fall in love, go to a university and learn things, right? And so on. These are the things we want out of life, and that's why we want to stay alive. Um, Teresa has no hope of having any of those things, right? She will never taste good food. She will never drink good wine. She will never fall in love. She does not have the parts of the brain required for those sorts of things, right? So what the interest could she have in staying alive is the question, right? Um, and here the parents are assuming that she has no interest in staying alive because she not cannot ever get the good things that come from life, right? Um, so if that premise is true and the other premise is true, um, and they do entail the conclusion, right? And I encourage you to take a logic or critical thinking course if you want to get more into the details of what it means, right, for premises to entail a conclusion. Here, we're going to largely operate on sort of a intuitive or gut level, right, which is like, okay, if this general principle is true, right, about it's okay to benefit people without harming someone else, and if baby Theresa is just situation is a specific case of that more general case, then we can conclude that, yeah, we should do it, right? It follows the more general case, and so it's fine to do, right? So it seems like the benefits argument is a good one, right? We have no reason to doubt it. Or the one potential reason to doubt it, we have considered more closely and decided in Theresa's case, it's not a problem. Okay, so what is the argument that we shouldn't do the transplant? Well, so the ethicist that we quoted, right, saying, well, you shouldn't kill person A to benefit person B, um, that, as stated, that didn't seem like the best principle, right, because it's got exceptions about self-defense and stuff. But again, reading it charitably, they may have been trying to say something like this. It is wrong to use people as a means to other people's goals. When we get to the section on Kant and what we call deontology, this principle is going to factor a lot, right? Uh, it may remind you of the golden rule a bit when we get into Kant, right? And we'll see why it's not quite the same thing as the golden rule, right? But it's something like um, other people, right, are sort of have a value, right? And they have their own interests, their own goals, and it's wrong to use them just as tools to get what you want, right? That's sort of not respecting the inherent value of another human if you steal from them or trick them, right? Or act violently towards them or coerce them or things like that, right? There's some sort of like, we feel that you've violated some sort of dignity that they have and worth they have and some right to pursue their own interests, right? So is that the problem here? Now, baby Theresa, again, she doesn't have any goals of her own. She doesn't have the parts of the brain required to have goals, right? Um, but at the same time, she doesn't necessarily have any interest in other people getting her organs, right? You can't ask her what she wants to do with her organs, right? There's no way she can consent to the transplant, right? So certainly not the case that we could say that, well, that's what baby Teresa wants, right? Is to have her organs transplanted. We have no idea. She's not even really someone with the cognitive capacity that it would make sense to say that they have an interest in that, right? So in a sense, we would be using Teresa's life to get some benefit for others. So you might see that as a violation of her autonomy, right? Every human, right, should have the ability to decide how to live their life, right? And she's not getting that chance. Again, as I said, this is why we think it's wrong to lie, cheat, and steal. You're using someone else for your benefit, not treating them as having sort of an inherent value and an inherent sort of autonomy over making their own decisions. But again, Teresa is a very special case, right? So it's worth asking, are we actually violating Teresa's autonomy, right? Um, because does it even make sense that she has any autonomy that can be violated, right? Um, what does it mean to have goals and interests, to be able to pursue your own interests, right? And to not interfere? Um, she doesn't have any beliefs. She doesn't have any desires. Uh, she doesn't have any ability to use those beliefs and desires to guide her own actions and pursue interests in her life. She has no prospect of ever gaining those, right? So certainly, any newborn, it's sort of an open question what cognitive capacities they have. Maybe even a healthy newborn wouldn't qualify as having beliefs and desires. But we do know that someday, all else equal, they will develop that ability. Theresa doesn't even have that. She will not be alive in a few days either way, right? Transplant or no. Um, so she can't make the decisions, right? We can't exactly be doing the transplant against her wishes because she doesn't have wishes, right? She doesn't have desires. Um, but just because someone can't make a decision for themselves, that doesn't always mean that we can just do whatever we want, right? So, if I find myself in a coma or something, right? My typically, like, your loved ones aren't going to just do whatever they want with you. They're going to think about, well, what would Nate want, right? Um, so the right thing to do, it seems, would be to consider what would be in her best interest, right? But again, she doesn't have any interest, right? She has no possibility of developing any interest. Her life will never improve, and then will be over in a couple days. Um, we could say, like, well, what would Theresa say if she could tell us what she wanted? Um, but again, that whole question doesn't quite make sense with, uh, right, baby Theresa ever. She doesn't have any preferences, no chance of any preferences, right? So in general, yeah, we don't use other people as a means, right, to our own ends. Um, but in a sense, does Theresa count as the sort of person whose autonomy can be violated? It's not clear. Okay, well, if that's a little, right, that argument against the transplant comes out a little fuzzy, right? It's not a slam dunk for sure. Um, here's another version, right, of an argument. Here's another kind of argument, right? Another general principle we have is just that killing is wrong, right? Um, or as we put it here, it's wrong to kill one person to save another, all else being equal. Again, right? Cases of self-defense, sometimes it is okay, but in general, um, right, killing is wrong unless there's good reasons, right? So if we think that Theresa counts as alive, she does have a heartbeat, right? She can breathe. Um, then if we transplanted her organs, we would kill her. Um, and then if killing is wrong, then the transplant is wrong, right? So bit of a simpler argument, right? We didn't even really have to do the 1, 2, 3, 4 numbering, right? It's wrong to kill. Taking Teresa's organs is killing, right? End of story. Um, okay, maybe that's a convincing argument, right? The question here is, are the premises true? Well, right, it's always wrong to kill one person to save another. That's not strictly speaking true, right? Sometimes we kill in self-defense and we think it's okay. Um, so we have to get more into the details. Which kind is the transplant? Is it the bad kind of killing or the morally excusable kind of killing, right? Um, given the details, there might be a good case for, right, this being an exception here. Um, Again, Theresa has no interest in living, will soon die anyway, and several other lives could be saved, right? So if it's okay to kill, like, whatever, a bad person, the axe murderer, right, who actually even does have interests, they just sort of have bad interests in hurting people, then maybe it's okay to kill someone who has no interests and will die anyways very soon, right? So again, we know there's exceptions to thou shalt not kill, right? Is Theresa one of those exceptions? Maybe so, right? Arguably. So that's one reason to potentially doubt whether this argument is convincing, right? That killing baby Teresa is wrong. We also, independent reason, right, to doubt this argument is whether is the premise that we're killing baby Teresa is even true, right? That sort of depends on what counts as killing. And again, Teresa is a very special case here, right? So there might be reason to doubt whether transplanting her organs would count as killing her, right? So um, what counts as dying and therefore killing, right, um, changes, right? At least in the US. So once upon a time, a heart transplant was illegal, right? Because death was defined as the heart stopping beating, right? Um, as soon as your heart stopped beating, they declared you dead, right? So in a heart transplant, the heart has to keep beating the whole time for the transplant to work, right? So technically, you're removing a still beating heart from someone, right? Putting it into someone else. So strictly speaking, you were killing the person, right, from whom you took the beating heart, right? They weren't dead yet. Their heart was still beating. We have since changed the definition of death, right, to being death of the brain instead of the heart stopping, right? So now we can perform heart transplants because the person could be brain dead, but the heart could still be beating. So is Theresa dead according to our current definition? No, right? So she's not brain dead, right? Her brain is still, again, keeping her brain is functioning enough to keep her heart beating, to keep her breathing and stuff, right? Um, but she has just very minimal amounts of brain, right? So um, by the current definition, yes, we would be killing her, right? By transplanting her organs because she's technically alive. But since the definition has changed already in the past, we can see it's not set in stone, right? Could there be an argument that maybe brain death is not the proper definition of killing, right? And maybe we need to include a bit more brain function, right? And to say that, oh, well, for someone to be truly alive, they need not only a brain stem, but also, right, the other parts of the brain that give them, again, conscious experience and all the other things we associate with the point of living. Um, she certainly lacks the brain functions that make life worth living, right? Um, so it's possible that after some investigation, actually the best definition, right, of killing is not just, or actually the best definition of death is not just brain death, but maybe lack of certain cognitive functions, right? All right, so summing up the baby Theresa case, right? Argument for the transplant seemed fairly convincing, right? The premises seemed true. They did seem to entail the conclusion that the transplant should be done, right? And then we considered two arguments on the other side, right, against the transplant, and these were less obviously convincing arguments, right? We were able to find premises that mm, um, it's an open question whether they're true or not, right? Um, so do we all agree then the transplant should be done? End of story. Well, maybe, right? It does seem, at least based on this discussion, that maybe there are stronger reasons for the transplant than against. But again, uh, the point of this class is not just to take the author, Rachel's word for this, or to take my word for it, right? Um, it's to train you to think through these issues yourselves, right? So, are there any reasons to think that one of the premises in the benefits argument is actually false, right? Or that the premises don't entail the conclusion? Is there any reason to think that in this discussion, right, of the arguments against the transplant, um, did we get something wrong, right? That's possible, right? They were left a bit fuzzy, right? So there's certainly room to come back and say, no, actually, there's a good reason to think that again, um, in Baby Teresa's case, this is a case of killing, and it's a case of unjust killing, right? Um, these are open; these are not decisive yet, right? So I say this to get you an early head start on practicing the sort of thing you'll be doing in your essay, right? Which would be something like you might write an essay that says, right, Rachel's response to the killing argument is flawed because, right, so and so. Come up with something original, right, about why it does count as killing, right, or um, why it counts as an unjust killing, right, and so on. We'll, there'll be lots of opportunities, and I'm going to go out of my way to point out points where, like, this is how you would write an essay, right? The idea is going to be pretty narrow, right? Relatively short essay, 4 to 6 pages, and you're going to be probably picking like a single premise or a single argument and like making a narrow point saying, this premise I think is false and here's why, sort of thing. All right, one more example just to get sort of the feel of, again, ethical reasoning, ethical inquiry, the sort of thing we're going to be doing for the next 5 weeks. Here we have another example involving young children, babies, uh, Jody and Mary, right? So, an Italian woman in the year 2000 became pregnant with conjoined twins, right? The twins were named Jody and Mary, so we seem to have a discrepancy in the how Jody is spelled here. Um, I don't know. Uh, Jody was sort of the stronger of the two, so that when you have conjoined twins, sometimes they share organs, right? And this was the case. So Jody had the heart on sort of her side and her chest, but it was pumping blood for the other twin. Um, so doctor said, look, um, these twins, as it stands, are not. This is sort of not a sustainable situation, and if we don't do something, they're both going to die within about 6 months of birth, right? But what we can do is we can separate them, right? And this one with the heart on their side, the stronger one will survive, right? And of course, the other one will not. Um, so if they separate them, Mary dies. Jody likely would live a normal lifespan, right? Um, so the parents actually, uh, being devout Catholics, given whatever their particular interpretation of Catholicism was, they thought it's not our place to intervene, right? God created the situation, um, so we're not going to second guess God, right? So God has a plan here, and if the plan is for both to die, then that's what happened, right? Um, Now the doctors disagreed with this, right? And they actually petitioned the court to have the operation performed against the parents' wishes. They won that uh, lawsuit or whatever it was, right? And they performed the operation. Jody was saved, right? So again, we have a moral question. What should we do, right? It's a tricky situation, um, a trickier situation than what should I do if I want a good grade in this course? Um, Something much more general, right? And so we have here a difference of opinion, right? Um, the parents thought, no, we should not interfere. The doctors and eventually the court said, yes, we should interfere. We should separate them, let one die so the other could live. So can we be more explicit about the reasoning on either side? It seems like it's likely that the reasoning, right, that the doctors were operating on was that the right thing to do is to save as many lives as possible, right? So both children were going to die unless we did something, right? Um, and we can do something to save one. So one life saved is better than no life saved, right? Um, Now, implicitly here, the assumption is that it's okay to kill one person prematurely to save another person if that other person was going to die anyways, right? Um, so again, within 6 months, both would die, right? So they said, well, we can kill one a few months early to save the other and have a normal lifespan, right? So implicitly, they're saying that's okay, right? So what makes it okay? So a poll, like they polled Americans, 70% said, yeah, that totally makes sense, right? In that situation, it's right to kill one, right, prematurely. Um, but what about it makes it right? Is it the fact that it's only 6 months, right, that the other twin would live? What if they would live a year, right? 5 years, 20 years, right? It seems to be tricky, right? If the key is the amount of time within which they were going to die otherwise, where is the line? Um, Not clear. Interesting question, right? Now, the parents appeared to be operating from totally different premises, right? They did not want the operation performed. Um, and again, we have to sort of like makes again we're going to be charitable and try to sort of reconstruct the art what's going on in the parents' heads sort of for them, right? When we don't have enough information to go on, try to give them the most reasonable argument possible. So they might have been thinking something like this. Um, Human life has a special value, right? We don't just kill innocent people. That's wrong, right? Mary is an innocent human, right? A baby, a newborn, but a human nonetheless, and certainly has done nothing wrong, does not deserve to be killed, right? Therefore, wrong to kill her, right? Even if it might benefit someone else, even if it might benefit her twin sister, right? Um, that's a totally reasonable principle to operate by, right? But again, the question, like with baby Theresa, do we have a special circumstance or do we have an exception, right, to our generally plausible rule of not killing innocent people. Um, and the exception seems again to pivot on uh, the fact that in this case, the life that could, right, the life that we are sacrificing is very limited in its sort of scope or in its opportunities, right, to really um, become a full human life, right? So you would just have 6 months of life, right? Is it right to sacrifice that 6 months in order to give someone else? Right? Now, in the Theresa case, it was more extreme. She had no consciousness at all. Um, so she just had, and she was dying in a few days, right? So there's just no prospect of all for having anything resembling a human life, right? A normal human life. Um, we even considered an argument that said maybe she shouldn't even count as being a living being, right? Um, Jody case, very less clear. Should be a conscious, right? A 6-month-old child is conscious, right? And probably even enjoys some pleasures and gets something out of life, right? Um, it's just for a very limited time, right? So she was definitely alive, and the doctors definitely killed her. But what they did is they added up the pros and cons and said, well, 6 months of life here versus potentially 80 years over here, we think it's worth it. So again, we're sort of going to survey each progressive one. We're surveying a little more quickly, right? So you can think on your own, right? What you think of that moral calculus, right? That oh, it's okay to sacrifice one life if they were going to die anyway within a certain amount of time, right? What's the dividing line? Why would that be the case? What is there a more general principle that makes that okay, right? We're leaving that open right now. Food for thought, right? But on to the third example, which is Tracy Latimer. So Tracy Latimer was a 12-year-old with severe cerebral palsy, right? So she was a 12-year-old that weighed 40 pounds. Mentally, her cognitive function was about equal to that of a 3-month-old baby, right? So pretty limited. Um, so in 1993, her father put her in the cab of his truck um, with a hose hooked up to the exhaust, right? Um, and she died of carbon monoxide. Right, he was feeding carbon monoxide into the cab, and she died. So this is typically a painless death. You sort of go to sleep, you don't get enough oxygen, and you die. Um, so he killed her, right, in what he thought was hopefully the least painful way, right? Um, so he didn't tell Tracy's mother. Tracy's mother comes home, finds that this has happened, right? That their daughter is dead, and she says, "I was relieved, right? I would have." She says she would have done it herself. She just didn't have the courage to do it. Now, the father was convicted of second-degree murder, right? This is illegal. Um, Carries a 10-year minimum sentence, right? The judge, seeing the whole picture, only gave him 1 year, right? But then the Supreme Court intervened and validated the sentence and gave him 8 years, right? So he served 8 years and was paroled. Um, so here the question is, did Tracy's father do wrong, right? Notice we're stepping sort of more and more extreme examples, right? Now we have a 12-year-old, right, that's being poisoned basically by her father, right? And the arguments are in the same vein, right? So Tracy is a human. She has a human life. She is alive, even if she has limited cognitive function, right? Um, and the question is, do these limitations, right, on her cognitive and other abilities mean she is an exception to the generally accepted rule that life has value and that innocent people shouldn't be killed? So one argument against what her father did, right, is an argument that says what he did was discriminate against the handicapped, right? So you might say, um, look, a general premise that we all accept is that handicapped people deserve the same rights as anyone else, right? And if it's the case that Mr. Latimer killed her because she was handicapped, right? Um, and handicapped people, right, have all the same um, rights as anyone else, right? A right to life being among them, then he did violate her right to life, and therefore it is wrong, right? Um, was this a case of discrimination on the basis right, of a handicap. Um, discrimination, what is discrimination, right? So whether this premise is true, um, whether what he did is wrong because it's a case of discrimination depends on what we count as discrimination, right? So in general, what we call discrimination is treating someone worse than others for no good reason, right? So sort of prototypical cases of discrimination include racial discrimination, gender discrimination, discrimination on the basis of sexuality or disability. Um, and what we say is um, we shouldn't treat someone differently just because they're of a different race. That's not a good reason to treat someone differently, right? Um, so if I'm, for example, applying for a job and I'm just as qualified or more qualified than other candidates, but you don't hire me simply because I'm a woman, that's discrimination, right? You're treating me differently simply on the basis of gender or sex. So the question is, did Mr. Latimer violate Tracy's right to life because she was handicapped? He treated her differently than she would treat someone else because she was handicapped. Well, if you ask him his reasoning, he says that was not the reasoning, right? It was not a case of discrimination. What he says was, I cared about my daughter, and she was managed to live to age 12 by repeated surgeries and other procedures, right, that were required to keep her alive. Um, they were very difficult, very painful for her, very intrusive. Just her simple everyday life was also involved a large amount of pain, right? And he thought that all this constant medical intervention to keep her alive amounted to a kind of torture, right? And if you ask him, he says he was trying to end her pain, right? Um, her life was daily, constant torture, and it was better off that she not be alive, and he was trying to do that for her. Right? So maybe you sympathize, right, with Mr. Latimer's reasons here. Um, but nonetheless, right, another sort of argument that you might make that he was wrong to do this is a kind of slippery slope argument, right? Um, so disability advocates, right, in this case said, look, on one level, we feel for Mr. Latimer, right? And we understand that she was in a lot of pain and that maybe she, in this particular case, may have been better off not alive, right? Better off dead if everyday life was so terrible for her, right? Um, but nonetheless, as a matter of principle, we have to keep sort of a strict rule against this sort of killing, right? We can't just allow parents or other people to decide when other people should live or die, um, because once we sort of open that gate, right, and we allow one mercy killing, um, who's to say it would stop, right? Then are people going to start, right, putting the elderly, the infirm out of their misery, right? Other sort of quote useless members of society, right? We know this is a terrible there's a terrible history to this sort of thinking, right? In Nazi Germany and so on, right, where they sort of like divide humans into sort of the worthwhile and the ones that are useless, and they start putting right the useless to death. Um, that's a that's bad news, right? This is the road to some of the worst atrocities um, in human history, right? So maybe that's convincing. One worry about it, I mean, if you've ever taken logic or critical thinking, you may have heard of the slippery slope fallacy, right? Um, those are tricky arguments. It's known as a fallacy because it can make for a bad argument, right? But it's also what we call an informal fallacy. So it kind of depends on the circumstances. Sometimes whether a slippery slope argument is good or bad. Typically, what makes it bad is if so the form of slippery slope argument is like if we do this one thing, then this next thing will happen, and then this next thing will happen, and this next thing will happen, and then eventually something really bad that we don't want will happen, right? And so we shouldn't do the first thing so that we can prevent the last thing. Um, sometimes those sorts of arguments can be true, right? But they're only true if every single step is actually true, right? So the question is it really true that if we let Mr. Latimer off, right, lightly, that then this is going to open the door to this Nazi nightmare, right? You'd have to argue for that each sort of step in that little slope independently. So that's sort of just what I said. You'll see similar sorts of arguments against in vitro fertilization, right? This is, well, if we allow science into the, reproduction, all of a sudden we're going to be in some sci-fi nightmare like Brave New World. I don't know if you've read that, but sort of all the babies are born in test tubes or whatever. So that's a kind of slippery slope argument we've seen, but that is pretty, I think we can agree, a bad sort of argument in the in vitro fertilization case, right? Because now it's very commonplace procedure and it seems to do a lot of good for people who can't conceive naturally, and it hasn't created any sort of sci-fi nightmare, right? Um, so this quote is a little sort of like supposed to be humorous. It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, right? Obviously, all predictions are about the future, right? But this is the problem with the slippery slope arguments, right? You say, if we let Mr. Latimer off lightly, we can predict all these other terrible things. Well, can you, right? Predictions are hard to make. And the more extreme the prediction, the more suspicious be, right? So if we're predicting a new Nazi regime on the basis of letting Mr. Latimer off lightly, we should maybe be suspicious of that prediction. It's pretty extreme. Okay, so we offered three examples, three arguments. Again, I'm not saying one argument is right or wrong, right? And I have sort of not, um, I'm not taking a strong stance either way on sort of the Latimer case or any of these other cases. I'd have to sort of spend more time and think through them and probably write a paper. But that's not the point, right? The point is not here to come to a settled conclusion on these three cases. These are examples of how we do moral reasoning, right? So here's some lessons we can draw from these examples. Number one, moral judgments need to be backed by good reasons, right? So you can't just say, oh yeah, Latimer's a monster, he should be in jail, right? I mean, you can just say that, but if you're going to be a good ethicist and right a good moral person, you have to have some reason for your judgment, right? So that someone asks, why do you think that? You can give them other premises that should entail that conclusion and are true. Number two, in making moral judgments, everyone's interests should be considered, right? Um, so we noticed this came up, right? In asking, okay, well, like the twins, right? Should we kill the one twin to save the other one? Well, we have to think about everybody, right? Even if we do in the end conclude that, yeah, we should separate the Siamese twins, we have to at least at some point consider the interests of that other twin, right? Before we came to that conclusion. Um, Part of the reason that we chose and the author chose these examples is they are sort of very tricky, puzzling moral questions, but they also probably elicit fairly strong emotions, right? So these involve killing innocent children, right? And this most of us have an instinctual revulsion for that sort of thing, right? Um, and that's not bad. I mean, it's good, right, to be sort of revolted by the thought of killing innocent children. Um, so your emotions can sometimes be a helpful guide, um, but sometimes it can also get in the way of reasoning, right? So if you came down on the side of, you know what, yeah, it was the right thing, right, to separate the twins, despite you may have come to that conclusion despite feeling like, oof, yeah, killing a newborn, it seems terrible, right? But after I reason through it, it seems like the best thing, right? So emotions can be a good guide, but then also sometimes they can block reasoning, right? Or reasoning can eventually come to a different conclusion, right? Um, and sometimes emotions are bad too. They tend to often be the sorts of like prejudice, selfishness, some just sort of bad cultural conditioning that we've grown up with that ends up just being wrong, right? Um, so in general, in this class, right, we're not going to say don't have emotions or anything, but we're going to say, in addition to whatever sort of moral feelings you have, make sure that you have backed them up with reasons. Um, like for example, right, if you lived 100 years ago, given the culture and the way you were raised, it's very likely that if you saw two people of different races, right, being married or kissing or something, you might have had a strong negative emotional reaction to that, right? A lot of people did back then. But now I think we can say in hindsight that that was wrong, right? It's perfectly fine, right, for people of different races to marry or be in love and kiss and do whatever, right? But that emotional reaction at the time was wrong. It was conditioned by bad cultural, um, right? So use your emotions, right? Be suspect of them, right? Um, and often feelings will contradict each other, right? Some of you might have strong emotional feelings in one direction. Some of you might have strong emotional the exact opposite in another direction. And how do we resolve them? Again, reasons, right? We use reasons. So a lot of focus, obviously, on reasons in this course. So, as we said, any moral judgment should be backed by reasons. I'll say it 100 more times in this course, right? So if anyone expresses some moral claim to you, that's wrong, this is wrong, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, you are perfectly within your rights to ask them why, right? Morality is not mere preference, right? So if someone says, I don't like coffee, right? And you say why, and they say, I don't, it doesn't taste good, it's too bitter. That conversation can end right there, right? Um, they can just simply say, I don't like it, none of your business, right? Um, with moral questions of what should be done, right? Um, there's a lot more room, right? I think you have a lot more right to be more rigorous and more inquiring and asking for good reasons, right? If someone's going to say you are not allowed to do this, right? They better have some good reasons, right? So, what counts as a good reason? Here's some things that don't count as good reasons, right? Just searching the internet until you find someone a blog where someone agrees with you, or a tweet where someone says what you say. Um, that's not enough, right? That's not a unbiased sort of review of the evidence out there, right? That's we people are susceptible to what we call confirmation bias, right? You look for stuff that supports what you already wanted to say, anyways, what you already wanted to believe, right? You kind of have to fight that in this course and be open to saying, um, my first instinct with this could turn out to be wrong. I'm going to look at the evidence, right? And if it turns out to be wrong, I'm going to change my mind, right? Again, there's so much more to be said about what counts as a good reason. We have whole disciplines and whole courses on that, logic, critical thinking. I encourage you to take them if you haven't. But for now, we're going to have to use our start with our intuitive notion, and we'll hone it as we get through the course. That a good reason is one that is true, right? That can be shown to be true, and is also sort of relevant to the issue at hand, right? That sort of lends support to if true, lends support to the conclusion. You'll notice that we've encountered a few kind of general moral principles, right? So uh, these are general and cited as moral principles because they're sort of widely accepted as true, right? And we often use them because everyone agrees with them, right? So you shouldn't use people, right? Sure, right? That everyone can agree with that. You shouldn't just kill innocent people, right? For no reason. Yeah. You shouldn't kill one person to save another within boundaries, right? Except in self-defense. But in general, yeah. We should do what will benefit people, right? If we can. Sure, why not? Um, every life is sacred. We should not discriminate against the handicapped. These are all sort of principles that were used in these previous arguments, and they often sound plausible, right? But we should make sure that those principles are true, that there aren't exceptions, and that they're being applied correctly in that case, right? So there might be the fact that in general, that principle is true, but this case is an exception, right? And there's reasons why. So there's no sort of general formula. You can always construct another argument for and against a claim. Um, it's very rare that sort of these most general ethical arguments are sort of resolved, right, very quickly. Um, we've been arguing about these things for thousands of years. We've made progress. I do believe there's philosophical progress, but they're very, very hard questions, and some of the stuff is still open, right? Um, so we're going to spend some time talking about the possibility that ethics is just purely subjective, and there's no such thing as being right or wrong about an ethical judgment. Um, we're going to come to, I think, the fairly strong conclusion that no, ethics is objective, right? If you can disagree, write a paper on it, but that's kind of, I'm putting my cards on the table. I think ethics is objective. So having good reasons for your moral judgments, this entails that morality is impartial, right? And that being moral is in part being impartial. So, what does it mean to be impartial? It means to treat everyone equally without favoritism, right? So, again, example of racism. So, if someone claimed, and people did claim this back in the 50s and earlier, right? Oh, people of different races shouldn't use the same bathroom, right? Um, Again, this is sort of a moral claim about what we ought to do, right? So you're within your rights to say why. Why do you think that? Um, and if the reason they gave was, oh, well, people of other races are unsanitary or unsafe, shouldn't, or some such thing, that's just an obviously false premise, right? So that's a bad argument. It has a false premise, right? Um, or if they claimed, I don't know, I just feel weird around people of other races. I don't want to be like in a bathroom and I feel vulnerable. Okay, that's not a reason, right? That's just a feeling. Again, not feelings, while sometimes guides to morality, are also almost just as often bad guides to morality, and they need to be supplemented by reason, right? Um, and this issue of impartiality and requiring reasons that apply to everyone and that are to be accepted by everyone also makes clear when treating other people differently doesn't count as prejudice, right? So suppose I'm doing a film about Martin Luther King Jr. and Chris Pratt auditions for the role, and I say, you know what, I don't think Chris Pratt is right for this role because like Martin Luther King Jr. was black and Chris Pratt is white, so I'm going to cast a black actor instead. Um, that's a good reason, right? It would be a weird sort of like confusing movie, right? If the movie character looked nothing like the actual historical person. So um, there can be good reasons for treating people differently on the basis of race, right? But they have to be relevant. All right, and finally, last slide. So we can begin again. We're going to explore lots of theories of generally what is the basis of moral decisions and how can we determine whether a certain decision is right or wrong. Um, And we're going to begin with a sort of very minimal conception that we can say will probably apply in all of these theories we see, which is that at a minimum, it should be morality is an attempt to guide your conduct by reasons, right? So you want to do the thing that there are the best reasons for doing. And because good reasons are impartial, right, we should also give equal weight to all the interests of each individual affected by your actions, right? So there's a combination of using reasons to guide your actions and treating each person as sort of having equal moral weight. Right? So a moral person is going to be someone who thinks carefully about what they're doing, examining the reasons for their actions, and counting each person right as being of equal worth, at least initially by default, right? Unless there's exceptions. Um, okay, well that is a lot. We are came in still just under an hour, right? Um, in general, I think the rest of the lecture just will probably be a little bit shorter. We're certainly going to come in way under like what the normal lecture time is supposed to be for a summer course, which is insane to me, right? And hopefully these will be a little bit more bite-sized things that you can watch, when you have an hour and you don't have to try to concentrate on anything for 4 hours or whatever it was originally. So that is it for now, and I will again, email me or come to my office hours if you have any questions at all, and go to your discussion sections. And even though this is remote, we are here for you. We are accessible. Please reach out if you feel the need.